my big passion has been to share some real knowledge about what's happening in the space, back it up with research. There's a lot of hype and a lot of, false messaging online about, AI is here, artificial general intelligence is here, and all these claims that are not really true. And so my whole purpose is to help people understand in this moment, because we need to know and we need to understand AI because it's going to have a huge impact on society moving forward.
Hi, Lee. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Here is your wonderful studio.
I have my own consulting called Long Horizon AI, and it really started when I was leading sales at an AI startup. And so one of the things that I needed to understand was really what was happening in the state of AI. And I actually started in January of 2023, and ChatGPT had come out a month and a half before I started. So the company was called CopyLeaks, and they do AI detection. So they've created AI models that can detect with some reliability whether AI has written the text. And because of that, I really needed to dig really deeply into what was happening in the world of large language models. I'd been interested in AI for many, many years. I studied philosophy in university, but the fact that it had suddenly sprung onto the scene and everyone was talking about it, I really went fully into learning as much as I could about AI. That kind of spiraled. So I got to a point where I really knew so much that the company asked me to start running education for everyone in the team, everyone overseas, all of the data scientists and AI engineers, and everyone sat for a monthly education session with me where I would talk about all the different breakthroughs, all the limitations, what we could expect to see next. And I just really developed a passion for that.
I see. So the reason why I asked Lee to do joining our interview is I attended a talk event 2 weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
New York AI Users Group.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the New York AI User Group is a local community of AI users, engineers, people who are interested in learning more about, or just interested in learning more about. I was invited by a friend of mine who also does AI consulting to the first event that I attended, and I was really interested in speaking there as well. So I just gave my third talk, which you attended on the 11th, and I think it's a great community. New York has got lots of sort of events and meetups and things like that. And this is an opportunity for all kinds of people to come together and learn about AI. And so my big passion has been to share some real knowledge about what's happening in the space, back it up with research. There's a lot of hype and a lot of, false messaging online about, AI is here, artificial general intelligence is here, and all these claims that are not really true. And so my whole purpose is to help people understand in this moment, because we need to know and we need to understand AI because it's going to have a huge impact on society moving forward.
So here is New York. There are many advertising agency, creative agency, marketing agency, and some of them have a long history because of New York is the center of advertising, right? And we saw some people who work at agency, in general, their life is so busy. That's why lack of learning new AI or technology, and also thanks to technology, but due to technology, maybe their client want to pay less than 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So that they are so terrified. Oh, what's going on in creative industry or advertising industry or marketing? So they may want to hear your advice. So what kind of advice or suggestion you want to tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for creative agencies, there are great opportunities to bring AI in to help with creating more ideas more quickly. Maybe for creating initial sort of designs or mock-ups, that is certainly going to help cut down on some of the resources and time that it takes to put together something creative. However, I think it's really a time now for people, especially creative agencies, to lean into that handcrafted creative content that is very much created by people and humans, because we value things that are made by hand and are built by people. There's a great book by the New York Times journalist Kevin Roose about preparing for AI future. And one of the things he talks about is how you can buy a bowl on Amazon for $5, for example. But that there are artisanal shops in the San Francisco area where somebody is selling a bowl that is handmade for $150. Right? And people will buy that because it is made by hand. And in fact, you can even see handprints in some of the handmade bowls that people sell, right? There's a thing called the effort heuristic, where we value things that we know took hard work to make. So he talks about this idea of leaving handprints. And I think for creative industries, we still need to value highly as a society creative output from human beings, because there's a lot of AI slop. AI slop being, low effort, AI generated content, whether it's writing or images or videos. And to stand out, I think it's still important for talented creative people to, now more than ever, show what you've got and show what you're made of, and show that really human-made creative and content and campaigns and copy and art is valuable. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and optimize the planning and ideation process using AI tools. But I think most people are just using ChatGPT to summarize an email or help them write something or help them to make images, and that's low effort, and everyone is doing that. So how do you stand out? I think you still stand out by going, look, what we do is good. You pay for us. We're not low effort. We're high attention to detail, really thoughtful, creative ideas. We've sat with the people who are the advertisers and tried to understand what they value, what their brand voice is. And an AI chatbot can only do so much when it comes to really translating that into something creative. Yeah.
If some creative agency want to invite you and then doing a workshop, do you want to do it?
Yeah, of course. I actually started out my career in ad tech.
Oh, really?
So I'm also part of 212 NYC, which is a big advertising network in New York of people and thought leadership and stuff like that. And I'm always happy to do that. I mean, I think what I find most is people are hungry for information. There's this signal to noise ratio that people are very hungry for signal or something that's really real, trying to understand what's noise and what they should ignore. And that's what I do for people, is I tell them, look, this is what's really happening. This is where the real opportunities are. Here's where they don't exist. Don't listen to this hype or that hype, and give them a true kind of sense of how best to understand what is real and where we are in this moment and how to think long term. That's why I call my consultancy Long Horizon AI. In planning in AI, and especially in robotics, long horizon planning is when a robot or an agent of any kind can make a plan many steps ahead and actually achieve that goal through going through many steps. And I think people need to focus on having a long horizon view of technology and humanity and their business, and think of those things in more grand terms than just what's happening right now. Anytime that you hear somebody say that AI agents are going to automate your business and you're going to be able to get rid of human workers and you can have AI do it, you should be very skeptical of that. That's not accurate today. There's no real good systems that do that reliably. Whenever you hear somebody talk about how AI is smart or smarter than a human, don't take that as true. Always question that, because AI is not smart as people, and there's a lot of barriers for that to happen. So when people say something is AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which is an AI system that is as good as any human expert across every domain or subject, when you hear that, you should ignore. That is not real. That is hype. And just a lot of the promises that are out there. I love AI, and I think it takes away from the amazing things that we actually are achieving with this technology. Really, if it sounds too good to be true, it's an old adage, but if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so lastly, so do you have any pain points so that I could help you or our audience also could help you?
Pain points for me personally, people just should feel encouraged to reach out to me. I'm never too busy to respond to someone. Depending on how you know of me, if you've seen me speak or you've read any content that I've done, don't assume that I'm too busy to talk, because I love to share my knowledge with people. That's how I make a living, and I also just very passionate about it. So I'm lucky to have those two things kind of aligned. But if somebody thinks maybe they're not ready to understand what's happening in this space, I would say it's never too early and never too late. Always feel free. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or Gmail, anywhere, and we can put those links. But
we can co-host some like a talk event. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Perfecto. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Lee. 1. Cut through the hype. Stay grounded in real AI research. Lee's mission is to help people understand what's really happening in AI. Not just buzzword like AZI is here. He built his consultancy, Long Horizon AI, after deeply researching large language models while leading sales at an AI detection startup. He believes that real impact when we stay grounded in research, understand the limits, and plan for AI's true impact on society. Okay. 2. Creative industries keep their human handprints. For agencies and creators feeling pressure from cheap AI-generated content. Lee says the winning edge is still handcrafted human work. He shared the effort heuristic, how we naturally value things made with real effort, like buying a handmade ball for $150 instead of $5 on Amazon. Authentic human-made ideas still stand out. AI can mock up and ideation, but human touch keeps your work stand out. Premium. 3. Long horizon mindset. Plan ahead, ask, write the questions. Lee reminds us to have a long horizon mindset. Think many steps ahead when integrating AI into business. Be skeptical of claims that AI will fully replace human workers. It's not just true. It's not true yet. Instead, use AI to free up time. Learn how it fits your team and stay curious about the real operations, real opportunities versus the noise. His big advice: don't wait. Now it's time to learn. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give it a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。